The screen lit up at 11:47, and there she was, on my security feed. I watched Pamela Torres move along the back fence line, her flashlight sweeping low across the grass as she approached my root cellar. She had no idea I was watching. Looking back now, I can tell you exactly how an HOA president destroyed herself trying to destroy me. She couldn't possibly know that every step she took was being recorded in high definition. Had no clue that the door she kept testing night after night had a camera hidden inside, waiting. And absolutely no idea that her obsession with what I kept underground was about to bury her instead. For 18 months, this HOA president had used every rule, every fine, every whispered accusation to drive me out. But tonight, she wasn't sending letters anymore. My name is Zachary Adams, and I own 3 houses in Maplewood Estates, a quiet subdivision outside Denver, Colorado. The one I live in, I inherited from my grandparents. The other 2, I purchased 5 years ago as rental properties. Legal, licensed, fully compliant with city regulations, and, as far as I could determine from reading every single page, the HOA bylaws as well. Long-term leases only, 12 months minimum, no short-term vacation rentals, no revolving door of strangers, just families looking for stable housing in a decent neighborhood. But to Pamela Torres, president of our homeowners association for 6 years running, I wasn't a neighbor. I was an infestation, a landlord in her pristine community, and she'd made it her mission to correct that mistake. The word itself seemed to disgust her whenever she said it. Landlord. As if owning property and renting it legally was somehow a moral failing she'd been appointed to punish. The root cellar sits behind my main house, built in 1943 by my grandfather's parents to store vegetables through harsh Colorado winters. I kept it for different reasons, partly sentiment, partly practicality, a cool, dry space for wine and rental property records, lease agreements, and maintenance log. I preferred to keep separate from the actual units. Nothing suspicious, nothing hidden, just organized paperwork belonging to a man who understood that documentation was the difference between winning and losing when someone came after you. And Pamela Torres had been coming after me since the day she discovered what I did for a living. The cellar had become her obsession, though I never understood exactly why. Perhaps because it was the one space on my property she couldn't see from the street, the one door she couldn't peer through during her morning walks past my house. Whatever she imagined I kept down there, it consumed her. The timeline of her campaign read like a legal brief I'd been assembling for months. March a special assessment of $2,500 per household for community gate upgrades, pushed through without a proper vote or financial disclosure. I was the only owner who requested to see the books. She refused. May, a $150 fine for grass exceeding regulation height by ½ an inch. Documented with a photograph she took herself at 7 in the morning. I appealed with my own photographs showing 3 neighbors with taller grass. None of them was fined. Fine reversed. July, a formal warning about my tenants parking more than 2 vehicles on the street, a violation that didn't exist anywhere in the HOA covenant. I responded with a certified letter quoting the actual parking rules. No response. September, a proposed bylaw amendment to cap rental properties at 10% of the community, a transparent attempt to force me to sell. The measure failed, 63 to 37, but she'd shown her hand. November, the first request to inspect all my properties for structural safety concerns. I declined. She escalated. My neighbor Dennis Bennett, a real estate attorney who lived 2 doors down, had watched this unfold with professional interest. She's building a case, he told me over coffee one morning, his voice careful and measured. Or she thinks she is. The problem for her is she doesn't actually have jurisdiction over anything she's claiming. HOA authority has limits, clear limits, and she's been pushing past them since month 1. He set down his cup, eyes serious. Keep documenting. Keep copies of everything. And Zach, he paused, stirring what remained. She's not going to stop. People like Pamela don't stop until they win or until they destroy themselves trying. I've seen it before in property disputes. The ones who think position equals power, they always overreach eventually. On the monitor, the shadow reached my cellar door, tested the handle, found it locked. Stood there for a long moment, flashlight beam probing the edges of the frame. searching for weakness in the wood or the hinges. Then she crouched down, examining the lock itself, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not fear, recognition. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was reconnaissance. After perhaps 30 seconds, she retreated into the darkness beyond my fence line, footsteps careful and deliberate on the frost-hardened grass. I reached for the notebook I kept beside my desk and recorded the time, the date, and the duration of contact. Suspected PT, fourth approach in 2 weeks. Attempted entry, lock examined. I didn't call the police, not yet. The pattern wasn't complete, and I needed more than suspicion. I needed certainty. I needed her to make a choice that couldn't be explained away, couldn't be dismissed as a misunderstanding between neighbors. Somewhere across the street, the lights in Pamela Torres's living room still glowed past midnight. I closed the notebook, turned off the monitor, and sat in the darkness of my office, thinking she would come back. I was certain of that now. The only question was whether she'd have the patience to wait, or whether her need for control would drive her through that door before I was ready. Either way, I would be watching, and I understood with perfect clarity that this was far from over. 2 days after the midnight visit, the escalation arrived in my mailbox. 2 envelopes, both bearing the Maplewood Estates HOA letterhead, both signed by Pamela Torres in her capacity as president. The first was titled, Notice of Violation Unregistered Auxiliary Structure and Unauthorized Business Activity. The accusation was creative, I had to admit. According to Pamela, my root cellar constituted an unregistered construction that may be utilized for commercial purposes not permitted within a residential zone. She demanded I either demolish the structure or submit to a full HOA inspection within 7 days. The second envelope contained a special assessment invoice for $3,200, payable within 30 days, designated for the HOA Legal Reserve Fund. No explanation of what legal matters required such funding. No record of any vote authorizing the charge, just a demand for payment with late fees threatened for non-compliance. I spent that evening at my desk, pulling records I'd organized months ago in anticipation of exactly this kind of attack. The cellar appeared in the original county survey as a documented structure, legally recognized 40 years before the HOA existed. It wasn't unregistered, it was grandfathered. The special assessment was easier to dismantle. Article 9 of the HOA bylaws required any assessment exceeding $500 to receive approval from 2/3 of homeowners in a properly noticed meeting. I checked the HOA's own records, the ones they were required to make available to members. No such meeting had occurred. No such vote had been recorded. Pamela had simply invented a bill and expected me to pay it. I drafted my response that night, attaching copies of the property survey, the relevant bylaw sections, and a formal request. My third, to review the HOA's complete financial records. Colorado law required compliance within 10 business days. I sent it certified mail. Return receipt requested. Documentation, always documentation. Saturday afternoon brought the confrontation I'd been expecting. Pamela Torres appeared on my front porch at 2:15, flanked by Ralph Castillo, the HOA vice president. Ralph looked uncomfortable, his eyes avoiding mine, his posture suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. Pamela looked triumphant. "Mr. Adams," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone of authority she seemed to believe her position granted her. "We're here to inspect your properties, the root cellar and both rental units. There have been concerns raised about structural safety and tenant living conditions. I remained in my doorway, not stepping aside, not inviting them in. Article 7, Section 3, I said calmly. The HOA's inspection authority is limited to common areas and exterior features visible from public thoroughfares. Interior spaces and private auxiliary structures require owner consent. I don't consent." Pamela's expression hardened. "You're hiding something. That cellar, your rental income, none of it adds up. Are you evading taxes, storing cash to avoid reporting?" I almost smiled. "If you have concerns about my tax compliance, I encourage you to contact the IRS. If you have concerns about structural safety, contact the Denver Building Department. Neither falls under HOA jurisdiction, and I won't be answering accusations without evidence or authority behind them." She left angry, Ralph trailing behind her with what might have been an apologetic glance over his shoulder. But she didn't leave quietly. That evening, I watched through my window as Pamela stood on the sidewalk 3 houses down, surrounded by 4 neighbors, her hands gesturing emphatically toward my property. When I walked outside to check my mail, the conversation stopped. 4 pairs of eyes followed me, then looked away. The community was being organized against me. Dennis called that night, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "She's telling people you're running an illegal boarding house, that your tenants are problematic, that you're hiding rental income in cash in that cellar to avoid taxes." He paused. "She also implied you might be storing other things down there. She didn't specify what. She didn't have to. People fill in their own fears." I asked if anyone was pushing back. "A few," he said. "Susan Miller told me she thinks Pamela's gone too far. Ralph Castillo apparently tried to talk her down after the visit to your place, saying this wasn't what he signed up for. But most people are staying quiet. Nobody wants to be her next target." The next morning, I received a call from the Martinez family, tenants in my second rental property. Mrs. Martinez sounded shaken. "Mr. Adams, a woman came to our door yesterday, said she was the HOA president and had the right to inspect our living conditions. She asked if we knew what you kept in your cellar, asked if we'd seen anything suspicious." I apologized, assured them they'd done the right thing by not letting her in, and documented the interaction in my growing file. This was new. She wasn't just coming after me anymore. She was approaching my tenants, trying to build a case through intimidation, attempting to weaponize anyone connected to my properties. I filed a formal complaint with the HOA board that afternoon, citing harassment of residents. I knew it would go nowhere with Pamela controlling the agenda, but it would create a paper trail. Everything created a paper trail now. That night, at 2:30 in the morning, the motion sensor alert woke me again. On the monitor, the same figure approached the cellar, but bolder now, more purposeful. She tried the handle, found it still locked, crouched down and pressed her face to the gap between door and frame, flashlight beam probing the darkness inside. She stayed longer this time, nearly 2 minutes, circling the structure, testing the hinges, running her hands along the wood like she was searching for weaknesses. I recorded everything, timestamp and duration logged in my notebook. Then I opened my laptop and began researching security upgrades, better cameras, motion-activated lights, and for the cellar specifically, a hidden backup system she'd never find even if she got inside. The pattern was clear enough to read. Letters had become confrontations. Confrontations had become harassment of third parties. And now, repeated surveillance of my property in the middle of the night. Each failed attempt pushed toward something more direct. If her legal approaches kept failing, the evidence suggested she might abandon them entirely. I couldn't know for certain what she'd choose to do, but I could prepare for what the pattern indicated was coming. The isolation came gradually, then all at once. Over the following 2 weeks, I watched my standing in Maplewood Estates erode through glances and silences rather than confrontations. At the community mailbox station, conversations would pause when I approached, resume in hushed tones when I left. I documented each instance in my notebook, not because any single snub constituted actionable behavior, but because patterns tell stories that individual moments cannot, and the pattern here was unmistakable. Someone had been systematically poisoning the well. Dennis confirmed what I already suspected when he called that first weekend. The HOA had held its monthly meeting the previous Thursday, and though I'd received no notification, Pamela had apparently devoted significant time to what she called community concerns regarding property standards and resident safety. She never named me explicitly. She didn't have to. References to certain homeowners prioritizing profit over neighborhood character and auxiliary structures of unknown purpose left no ambiguity about her target. She had raised questions about whether rental properties attracted transient elements and whether the community should consider enhanced oversight mechanisms for landlords operating within the subdivision. The proposal hadn't advanced to a vote, but the seeds had been planted. Dennis said at least a dozen residents had nodded along, their faces grim with manufactured concern. "She's good at this," he admitted. "She speaks in implications, never says anything directly actionable, but leaves people with impressions that are worse than accusations. By the time you could sue for defamation, the damage is already baked into how people see you." The community's online discussions became her amplifier. Dennis forwarded me screenshots over the following days. One post asked residents to remain vigilant about unusual activity and report any concerns about property usage to the HOA board immediately. Another, posted the day after she'd been turned away from my door, expressed disappointment that some community members refused to engage in good faith transparency and questioned what exactly requires such aggressive privacy protection. The comments ranged from supportive to suspicious, but the effect was cumulative. Each post added another layer to the narrative: landlord, secretive, hiding something, possibly criminal. What she didn't understand was that I'd stopped caring about reputation the moment I recognized this for what it was: a campaign of attrition, a siege designed to exhaust my resources and resolve until I either sold my properties or submitted to her control. But I'd learned long ago that battles aren't won by defending perception. They're won by accumulating evidence until the weight of truth becomes undeniable. So I let her posts stand unchallenged, let the whispers continue uncorrected, let the isolation deepen while I focused on what actually mattered. Every screenshot Dennis sent went into my file. Every time-stamped interaction is logged. Every instance of harassment against my tenants was documented with dates, descriptions, and, where possible, corroborating witnesses. The Martinez family had started keeping their own notes at my suggestion. Mrs. Martinez told me Pamela had returned twice more, once asking about noise complaints that didn't exist, once simply standing across the street watching their house for 10 minutes before leaving. I added both incidents to the record. The cracks in Pamela's support structure revealed themselves over the following week, though I had to look carefully to see them. Susan Miller caught my arm one afternoon as I walked past her house, her voice low and urgent. "I know what she's doing to you," she said. "She did it to me 3 years ago. Fined me $500 because my dogs barked during the day. She said, no one ever complained, no evidence. When I fought it, she started telling people I was an unstable widow who couldn't control her animals." Susan's eyes were hard with old anger. I took it to small claims court eventually. Won, got my money back, but it took 8 months, and by then half the neighborhood thought I was the problem. I asked why she hadn't spoken up at HOA meetings, pushed back against Pamela's current campaign. Susan laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because I'm 62 years old, I live alone, and I don't have the energy to become her target again. But I see what she is, and I'll testify if it ever comes to that." I thanked her and added her name to a separate list. Potential witnesses. The file was growing. 3 days later, Ralph Castillo found me at the gas station, pulling up to the adjacent pump with a look of practiced casualness that suggested the encounter wasn't accidental. "I want you to know," he said quietly, not making eye contact. "I didn't sign up for this. The inspections, the assessments, and going after your tenants. She told me it was about maintaining standards." He shook his head. "I got fined $200 last year because my RV was visible through my open garage door for more than 2 hours. A rule I'd never heard of. Nobody had. She invented it after the fact. I asked him why he stayed on the board. Because if I leave, she replaces me with someone who actually believes her. At least this way I can see what she's planning." He finished pumping, hesitated. "She's not going to stop. You know, whatever's in that cellar. She's convinced it's proof of something. She talks about it constantly at board meetings. Says you're hiding evidence of tax fraud, illegal subletting, God knows what else." He drove away before I could respond, leaving me with another data point in a pattern that grew clearer by the day. Not everyone believed her, but believing and acting were different things, and fear kept most people silent. That night, at 1:15 in the morning, the alert woke me. On the monitor, Pamela Torres approached the cellar with a larger bag than before, and a flashlight bright enough to cast sharp shadows across my lawn. She didn't just test the door this time. She knelt before it, examining the lock with what looked like focused intent, running her fingers along the keyhole, the hinges, the frame's edge. She pulled something from her bag, a small tool I couldn't identify clearly, and held it near the lock for several seconds before apparently thinking better of it. Then she stood, circled the structure once more, and retreated into darkness. I noted the time, the behavior, the hesitation. She was close now, Whatever internal barrier had kept her from crossing the final line was eroding. I saved the footage to the cloud backup, checked that the hidden interior camera remained undetected in its position, and closed my laptop. The system was ready. The question was whether she'd wait or whether the obsession would finally drive her forward. Based on everything I'd observed, patience didn't seem to be among her remaining virtues. The morning after Pamela's latest visit to my cellar, I sat at my desk with Colorado revised statutes open on my laptop and a legal pad filled with notes. Criminal trespass, CRS 18-4502. First degree if entering a dwelling or enclosed structure. Class 5 felony if the intent involves committing another crime inside. I read the language 3 times, parsing each clause, understanding exactly where the lines were drawn. Dennis had given me the overview weeks ago, but I needed precision now. The difference between a misdemeanor and a felony could hinge on a single element: whether she broke a lock, whether she took something, whether she damaged property in the process. I needed to understand every scenario before any of them occurred. I called Dennis that afternoon and laid out what I was planning. I want to upgrade the cellar security, I told him. Cameras inside, motion sensors, cloud backup. I want to know if there's any way that could be construed as entrapment if she decides to enter. Dennis was quiet for a moment, thinking through the question with the care I'd come to expect from him. Entrapment requires inducement, he said finally. You'd have to encourage her to commit a crime she wouldn't otherwise commit. Installing security on your own property isn't an incentive. It's protection. You're not inviting her in. You're not leaving the door open. You're not baiting her with anything. He paused. But I'd recommend not changing the lock. Keep it simple, basic. If she breaks in, it should be entirely her choice, her effort, her tools. You don't want any argument that you made it easier or harder than normal. Just document everything and let her decide what she's willing to do. I thanked him and wrote down his advice word for word. The security upgrades took 3 days to complete. I installed 2 cameras inside the cellar, one visible in the corner near the door, one hidden behind a stack of storage boxes, where it would continue recording even if the first was discovered and destroyed. Both were fed to a cloud server I could access from my phone. Motion sensors at the door would alert me within seconds of any approach. I tested the system repeatedly, checking angles, confirming that faces would be identifiable, and ensuring the night vision captured detail even in complete darkness. The cellar wasn't large, perhaps 12 feet by 15. With shelving along 2 walls and my file boxes stacked in organized rows. Anyone entering would be recorded from the moment they crossed the threshold. There would be no ambiguity about who, when, or what they did inside. I spent an evening reviewing everything I'd accumulated on Pamela's pattern of behavior. The timeline filled 3 pages of my legal pad. 18 months of escalation, each step following logically from the last. Written demands were used when verbal requests failed. Fines were imposed when demands were ignored, public accusations when fines were overturned, tenant harassment when I refused to engage, and now, physical surveillance of my property in the middle of the night, each visit bolder than the last. The progression had an almost mathematical quality. Every boundary she encountered, she tested. Every resistance she met, she tried to circumvent. The only boundaries she hadn't crossed were legal ones, and those were eroding. The tool she'd held near my lock 3 nights ago told me everything I needed to know about where her thinking had arrived. She wasn't researching anymore. She was preparing. The formal notice arrived on a Thursday, sent via certified mail with a 72-hour deadline. Emergency property inspection required, the header announced. Pamela cited Article 12.7 of the HOA bylaws, claiming authority to access my cellar and both rental units due to documented concerns about structural integrity and tenant welfare. The letter referenced complaints from neighbors, though no specific complaints were attached. It demanded full access within 3 days or threatened appropriate enforcement action, including but not limited to daily fines, lien proceedings, and potential legal remedies. I read it twice, then pulled up the actual bylaw on my computer. Article 12.7 applies exclusively to emergencies verified by municipal authorities, fire department, building inspectors, code enforcement, not HOA presidents with personal vendettas. I drafted my response that evening, citing the bylaw's actual language, attaching my previous requests for financial records that remained unanswered, and formally declining the inspection. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested, with copies to every board member, including Ralph Castillo. The deadline would pass on Sunday. I had no illusion that Pamela would accept my refusal as final. Every previous rejection had pushed her toward more aggressive action, and this one would be no different. The question wasn't whether she would try something. The question was what form it would take and when. I checked the camera feeds one more time, confirmed the cloud backup was functioning, and allowed myself a moment of something that wasn't quite satisfaction but close to it. Readiness, perhaps. The system was complete. The evidence trail was documented. The legal framework was clear. If she chose to cross the line, it would be entirely her decision, and so would the consequences. Thursday night passed without incident. Friday is the same. The 72-hour deadline expired at 6 p.m. on Sunday, and I spent that night watching the security feeds with something approaching anticipation. Nothing. Monday brought rain, the kind of steady Colorado drizzle that turns lawns to mud and keeps most people indoors. I began to wonder if my refusal had finally registered, if perhaps the formal citation of actual bylaws had made her reconsider. By Tuesday evening, I'd almost convinced myself she might pursue other avenues. Legal threats through attorneys, another attempt at bylaw amendments, something that maintained at least the pretense of legitimate authority. I should have known better. People like Pamela Torres don't retreat. They wait for darkness. The alert came at 2:23 in the morning, 71 hours after the deadline she'd set. I was already awake, unable to sleep, reviewing rental applications for a unit turning over next month. My phone buzzed with the motion sensor notification, and I opened the camera app with hands that remained surprisingly steady. There she was, Pamela Torres crossing my backyard in dark clothing, a large bag over one shoulder, flashlight beam cutting through the moonless night. But something was different this time. Her movements weren't tentative. She walked directly to the cellar door with the certainty of someone who had already made their decision. No pausing to look around, no testing the handle. She knelt immediately, pulled something from her bag, and went to work on the lock. I watched her manipulate the mechanism for nearly 3 minutes. The lock wasn't sophisticated, but it wasn't simple either. She'd clearly practiced. At 2:26, the door swung open, and Pamela Torres stepped inside my cellar. I noted the timestamp in my notebook, then picked up my phone and dialed 911. "I'd like to report a break-in in progress," I said, keeping my voice level. "The address is 1847 Maple Drive, Maplewood Estates. Someone has just broken into a structure on my property. I have video of the entire entry. I'm inside my house, and I'm safe." The dispatcher asked if I knew the intruder. "Yes," I said. "Her name is Pamela Torres. She's the president of our HOA." There was a pause on the line, perhaps surprise at the specificity, before the dispatcher confirmed units were being sent. 10 to 15 minutes. I thanked her and returned to watching. Inside the cellar, Pamela's flashlight swept across the shelving, the storage boxes, the wine rack along the far wall. She moved with purpose now, pulling boxes from shelves, photographing documents with her phone, lease agreements, maintenance records. I kept copies for my own reference. She was building a case, I realized, looking for anything she could use against me, any discrepancy she could report to authorities or brandish at the next HOA meeting as proof of her suspicions. The phone screen illuminated her face as she worked through box after box, capturing page after page. The visible camera recorded everything in sharp detail. She hadn't noticed it yet. Mounted in the corner near the door, its small lens nearly invisible in the shadows. At 2:34, she looked up. I watched her eyes find the camera, watched the realization spread across her features. For a moment, she froze, flashlight beam fixed on the device, face cycling through emotions I could read even through the grainy night vision. Shock, fury, then something that looked almost like a calculation. She grabbed a wooden crate from the corner, dragged it beneath the camera, climbed up, and ripped the device from its mount. The feed went dark. But the hidden camera, positioned behind the stack of boxes on the opposite wall, continued recording. I watched her step down, scan the cellar with new paranoia. She didn't find the second one. It was too well concealed, the lens barely visible between two cardboard boxes that looked like they hadn't been moved in years. She returned to her search, more frantic now, checking over her shoulder every few seconds. At 2:41, red and blue lights appeared on the street. Pamela didn't see them at first. Focused on a box of insurance documents she was emptying onto the floor. Then the flashlight beam swept across my yard, and she went still. I watched her face as the reality of her situation registered. She was inside a locked structure she'd broken into, surrounded by scattered evidence, with a destroyed security camera at her feet. For several seconds, she didn't move. Then she started toward the door, perhaps hoping to slip out before being seen. But the beam of a police flashlight caught her as she emerged into the night. "Police don't move. Show me your hands." I stepped out my back door, moving slowly, hands visible. Sergeant James Rodriguez stood at the corner of my house, his partner covering from near the fence. Pamela had frozen halfway between the cellar and the property line, her bag still over her shoulder, hands raised to shoulder height. Even from 30 feet away, I could see the rage in her posture, the disbelief that this was actually happening. "That's her," I said calmly to Rodriguez. "Pamela Torres, the HOA president. She broke the lock to get in. I have video of everything." Rodriguez nodded, his flashlight beam fixed on Pamela. "Ma'am, I need you to put the bag down slowly and step away from the structure." Pamela didn't comply. Instead, she pointed at me. "This is a setup I have every right to be here. Article 12.7, Emergency Access Authority. He's been hiding something in that cellar for months." Rodriguez's voice remained professional. "Ma'am, put the bag down. We can discuss the circumstances once you've complied." She lowered the bag slowly but kept talking, her voice rising. "You don't understand. I'm the HOA president. I had probable cause." I stepped forward but kept my distance. "Sergeant, Article 12.7 requires verification from municipal authorities, fire department, building inspectors. She has none of that. She's citing a bylaw she's misrepresenting to justify breaking into my property." Rodriguez looked at me, then at Pamela. "Sir, do you want to press charges?" I nodded. "Yes, breaking, destruction of property. She destroyed a security camera inside, and she's been photographing my personal documents without authorization." Pamela's face went white. "You can't. I've served this community for 6 years. Everyone knows me." Rodriguez gestured to his partner, who approached Pamela with handcuffs. "Ma'am, you're being detained pending investigation of criminal trespass and property destruction. You have the right to remain silent." As his partner began the arrest procedure, Rodriguez turned to me. "You mentioned you have a video." I held up my phone. "From 2 cameras. One she destroyed, one she didn't find. Cloud backed up. I can show you everything right now." He nodded slowly. "Let's see it." The backyard had become a stage. Red and blue lights painted the fence in alternating colors, and the commotion had drawn an audience. I counted 8 neighbors standing at the edges of their properties, some in bathrobes, others still dressed from a late night. Susan Miller watched from her porch, arms crossed. Dennis Bennett stood at the corner of his yard, phone in hand, likely recording. Even from a distance, I could see the shock on faces that had avoided mine for weeks. The woman they'd been told to fear was standing in handcuffs while police officers examined the cellar she'd broken into. The narrative Pamela had spent months constructing was unraveling in real time. Sergeant Rodriguez positioned himself between Pamela and the growing crowd, his partner securing the scene around the cellar entrance. "Sir," Rodriguez said to me, "you mentioned video evidence. Walk me through what you have." I opened the camera app on my phone and handed it over. 2 cameras, one visible, which she destroyed at 2:34, one hidden, which captured everything after, cloud backed up. I can provide access credentials for your records. Rodriguez watched the footage for a long moment, his face professionally neutral, then handed the phone to his partner. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, turning to Pamela, "do you want to tell me what you were doing inside that structure?" Pamela's composure had fractured visibly in the minutes since her arrest. Her hair was disheveled, her dark clothing smudged with dust from the cellar floor, but her voice still carried the authority she seemed to believe her position granted. "Authorized inspection, Article 12.7. Emergency access for community safety." Rodriguez glanced at me. I kept my voice even. "Article 12.7 requires written authorization from a municipal authority, fire marshal, building inspector, code enforcement, She has none because none exists. The partner looked up from the phone. Sergeant, video's clear, lockpicking, document photography, and camera destruction, all time-stamped. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Ma'am, picking a lock to enter a structure without the owner's consent is breaking under Colorado law. Destroying a security device is criminal mischief. Photographing someone's private documents raises additional concerns. Pamela's face flushed. Those documents could be evidence of fraud. I was protecting the community. Rodriguez held up a hand. Ma'am, I'd advise you to stop talking. If you had suspicions of fraud, the appropriate authority is the IRS. None of that authorizes you to break into someone's property. A murmur ran through the watching neighbors. I heard fragments. She actually broke in. The lock. She picked it. Susan Miller had moved closer, standing now at the edge of my property line. Her expression was grim but unsurprised, the look of someone watching a prediction come true. Ralph Castillo had appeared at some point, still in his pajamas, standing apart from the other neighbors with his arms folded tight across his chest. When Pamela's eyes found him in the crowd, something shifted in her posture. Ralph, tell them about the board meetings, the concerns we discussed. Ralph didn't move, didn't speak. After a long moment, he shook his head slowly. We discussed concerns. Pamela, we never discussed breaking into anyone's property. The silence that followed seemed to echo. Rodriguez's partner approached with a clear evidence bag. Ma'am, I need to collect the items in your bag. Pamela clutched the strap reflexively, then released it. The partner opened it carefully, inventorying the contents. A lockpick set, a flashlight, her phone, screen still displaying the last photograph she'd taken, a folder of printouts about landlord regulations and tax reporting, and at the bottom, a small notebook filled with handwritten observations, dates, times, notes about my comings and goings, my tenants' schedules, and the frequency of my visits to the cellar. She'd been conducting surveillance for weeks. The pattern I'd documented had a mirror image I hadn't fully understood until this moment. Rodriguez examined the notebook, flipping through pages, his expression hardening as he read. Ma'am, this appears to be a detailed log of the victim's activities over an extended period. Combined with the break-in and the photographs, this suggests stalking behavior. Pamela's voice rose. It's not stalking, it's due diligence. Rodriguez cut her off. Your responsibilities as HOA president do not include surveilling residents or breaking into private structures. You're being charged with first-degree criminal trespass, criminal mischief, and invasion of privacy. Additional charges may be filed pending review. He nodded to his partner. Read her rights again and transport her for booking. I watched as they led Pamela toward the patrol car, her protest continuing but growing fainter. This isn't over. I'll have my lawyer 6 years I've protected this community. The car door closed, cutting off her voice. The lights continued their rotation, red and blue across the faces of neighbors who had believed her accusations, who had avoided me in the street, who had let her reshape their perception of a man they'd never bothered to know. I felt no satisfaction, only a tired recognition that the hardest part wasn't over. Legal proceedings would follow, community fallout would follow. The damage she'd done to my reputation wouldn't disappear with her arrest, but the truth was documented now, time-stamped and backed up to servers she couldn't reach. Whatever came next, it would be built on evidence rather than implication. Dennis approached after the patrol car pulled away, the crowd slowly dispersing into the pre-dawn darkness. You handled that perfectly, he said quietly. Calm, factual, let the evidence speak. I nodded, suddenly exhausted. She had a notebook, weeks of surveillance, dates, times, my routine. Dennis exhaled slowly. That changes things. That's not just trespass. That's a pattern, maybe stalking charges. Susan Miller appeared beside us, her face drawn but resolute. I'll testify, she said, about what she did to me, about the pattern, whatever you need. I thanked her, meaning it. Then I walked back toward my house, leaving the cellar door open for the officers still documenting the scene inside. The night had turned cold, and I had nothing left to prove to anyone still watching. The days following Pamela's arrest moved with a strange quality, as if the neighborhood itself was recalibrating. I noticed it first at the mailbox station, where conversations no longer paused when I approached. People made eye contact now. Some nodded with what might have been an apology in their expressions. I didn't hold it against them. Fear makes people behave in ways they might not choose otherwise. Pamela had understood that instinctively and exploited it systematically. Now that fear had a different target, the community was slowly rearranging itself around the new reality. Whether that rearrangement would last, whether it represented genuine change or merely a temporary shift in allegiance, remained to be seen. Pamela Torres had been released on a $5 bond, with conditions that included a restraining order keeping her 200 feet from me, my properties, and my tenants at all times. The news spread through neighborhood channels within hours of her booking. Dennis forwarded me screenshots of the online discussions, though I didn't need them to gauge the reaction. The comments ranged from disbelief to vindication to careful silence from those who had most publicly supported her campaigns against me. A few people defended her still, claiming I must have provoked the situation, that there had to be more to the story, that a woman who had served the community for 6 years deserved the benefit of the doubt. But they were outnumbered now by voices asking questions that should have been asked months ago. Why had she been so obsessed with one resident's cellar? Why had financial records never been made available despite repeated formal requests? What exactly had she been doing with the HOA's money for 6 years? The questions multiplied faster than the defenders could deflect them. The emergency HOA meeting convened on Saturday afternoon, the first gathering without Pamela Torres at the podium in over half a decade. Ralph Castillo chaired the session with visible discomfort, reading from notes he'd clearly prepared the night before, his voice occasionally catching on words he seemed to find difficult. The community room was standing room only, nearly 60 residents packed into a space designed for 40. I sat in the back row, observing rather than participating. This wasn't my forum. I'd said what needed to be said to the police, documented what needed to be documented, and protected what needed to be protected. Whatever the community decided to do with the information was their concern, their responsibility, their opportunity to become something better than what Pamela had shaped them into. Susan Miller was the first to speak when Ralph opened the floor. Her voice carried clearly through the room as she described the $500 fine for her dogs, the harassment that followed when she contested it, and the 8 months of small claims court that had consumed her savings and peace of mind. I won, she said, but I lost something too. I stopped trusting this community. I stopped believing anyone would listen if I spoke up. I watched her do the same thing to others, and I stayed quiet because I couldn't afford to fight again. The admission hung in the air, uncomfortable and honest, and something shifted in the room. Susan's willingness to speak first seemed to break a seal that had kept others silent for years. A young couple described a $300 fine for a basketball hoop that violated a regulation nobody could locate in the actual bylaws. They'd paid rather than fight, not knowing they had the right to demand proof. Howard Prescott, who had lived in Maplewood Estates longer than almost anyone, explained how his request for a wheelchair ramp had been denied for aesthetic reasons until he threatened legal action. For 3 months, his wife had struggled with the front steps while Pamela insisted the neighborhood's appearance mattered more. The testimonies built on each other, each one revealing another facet of the same pattern. Ralph himself admitted to the $200 fine for his RV, a rule invented specifically to target him after he questioned one of Pamela's budget proposals. "I should have fought harder," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have seen what she was doing to others instead of just keeping my head down." That was the thread connecting every story: isolation. Each victim had suffered alone, believing their experience was unique, not recognizing the systematic nature of what Pamela had constructed. The room grew quieter as the recognition settled over the assembly. They had all been complicit to some degree, not out of malice, but out of the comfortable assumption that someone else would handle it, that the person in charge must know what they were doing, that questioning authority wasn't worth the personal cost. Then came the financial questions. A retired accountant named Barbara Hughes had volunteered to review the records that were finally made available after Pamela's arrest. Documents that should have been accessible to any member upon request, but had been withheld for years behind excuses and delays. Her findings were preliminary but damning. Over 6 years. Approximately $47,000 in HOA funds had been allocated to categories that lacked supporting documentation. Legal reserve funds with no legal expenses recorded, administrative costs with no invoices attached, special assessments that never translated into the improvements they supposedly funded. The gate upgrade that had cost residents $2,500 each had been completed by Pamela's brother-in-law, Barbara discovered, with no competitive bids and no proof that the full amount had actually been spent on the project. "I can't say definitively where this money went," Barbara said carefully, her accountant's caution evident in every word. "But I can say with confidence that it's not where the records claim it should be." Dennis, seated near the front, spoke up. "This may constitute embezzlement under Colorado law. The board should consider engaging independent legal counsel and potentially reporting these findings to the district attorney's office." The murmuring that followed had an edge of anger that hadn't been present before. Financial betrayal, it seemed, struck deeper than personal harassment. People could forgive social manipulation. They had more difficulty forgiving theft. Ralph called for a vote on interim leadership. 94% of those present elected him as temporary president, with a mandate to establish transparent financial oversight and revise bylaws that had been weaponized for too long. He accepted with a brief statement about restoring trust, respecting boundaries, and rebuilding what had been damaged. I didn't volunteer to speak, and no one asked me to. After the meeting adjourned, a handful of residents approached me individually. Some apologized for believing Pamela's implications, for avoiding me in the street, for letting fear override their judgment. Others thanked me for standing firm when they hadn't been able to, for documenting everything, for refusing to be driven out. I accepted both with the same measured response. What happened next would determine whether anything had actually changed, or whether the community would simply find a new equilibrium and forget the lessons that should have been learned. That evening, I walked out to the cellar for the first time since the police had finished documenting the scene. New lock installed, stronger than before. The new camera positioned at a better angle. Everything restored to order, perhaps better than it had been. I opened the door and stepped inside. The shelves were neat, the boxes reorganized, the space exactly as it should have been all along. Nothing is worth breaking laws to find. Nothing is worth destroying a reputation to expose. Nothing is worth 6 years of accumulated power to risk. Just paperwork and wine, and the quiet satisfaction of a man standing in a space that belonged to him. Protected now by more than locks and cameras. Protected by the truth, documented and time-stamped, and backed up where no one could erase it. The email from the district attorney's office arrived 4 months after the arrest, on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I read it at my desk with a cup of coffee cooling beside me, the words carrying the weight of finality I'd been waiting for without quite acknowledging it. Pamela Torres had accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial. The charges and their consequences were laid out in precise legal language that I translated into simpler terms as I read. First-degree criminal trespass, criminal mischief, invasion of privacy, guilty on all counts. The sentencing reflected the severity of what she'd done without being excessive. 18 months of supervised probation, a $2,500 fine payable to the state, $1,200 in restitution to me for the destroyed camera and damaged property, a restraining order prohibiting any contact with me or approach to my properties for 3 years, 100 hours of community service, mandatory completion of an anger management program. The terms were firm but measured, the kind of consequences that acknowledged wrongdoing without destroying a life. I felt no disappointment that she hadn't received jail time. Prison wasn't the point, accountability was. The civil case moved separately through the courts, initiated by the HOA itself against its former president. Barbara Hughes's preliminary findings had been confirmed and expanded by a forensic accountant hired with community funds. The final tally of misappropriated money reached $38,500, slightly less than the original estimate, but still substantial enough to constitute felony embezzlement. Pamela agreed to a settlement rather than face additional criminal charges. Full repayment over 36 months. Permanent prohibition from serving on any HOA board in the state of Colorado. And as a condition of the agreement, she would sell her home and relocate outside Maplewood Estates within 60 days. 6 years of accumulated power, of careful manipulation, of treating her position as permission to control others. And it ended with a moving truck and a quiet departure that most neighbors didn't even witness. I happened to be outside when she left, retrieving the mail on a Saturday afternoon. She saw me from across the street as the last boxes were loaded. Our eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds. Then she got in her car and drove away. I never saw her again. The HOA that remained was barely recognizable from the organization Pamela had shaped. Ralph Castillo won the official presidential election with 78% of the vote, running on a platform of transparency and restraint that would have seemed radical 2 years earlier. The new bylaws, drafted by a committee that included Dennis Bennett and 3 other residents with legal backgrounds, established clear boundaries that should have existed from the beginning. Article 4 now explicitly protects the right to rent property on long-term leases without HOA interference. Article 7 limited inspection authority to common areas only, with written consent required for any access to private property. Article 12 eliminated the emergency access provision, replacing it with a requirement to involve municipal authorities for any legitimate safety concerns. Article 15 mandated quarterly publication of all financial records and annual independent audits. Article 16 created a formal grievance process for residents who believed they'd been targeted unfairly by board members. The documents ran to 32 pages of careful language designed to prevent anyone from ever doing what Pamela had done. My rental business continued without incident. The Martinez family renewed their lease for another 2 years, grateful for a landlord who had protected their privacy when it would have been easier to cave to pressure. The second property found new tenants within a month of the previous family's departure, a young couple with a toddler who had no idea about the history that had unfolded in their neighborhood and no reason to learn it. I maintained the properties as I always had, paid my taxes, filed my paperwork, kept documentation of everything, a habit that had served me well and that I saw no reason to abandon. Dennis and I developed something like friendship in the aftermath, meeting occasionally for drinks and conversation that ranged beyond property law into territory I hadn't explored with anyone in years. Susan Miller brought cookies at Christmas and checked in periodically to make sure I was doing all right. I always was. On a warm evening in late May, I walked out to the cellar with a bottle of wine I'd been saving for an occasion that felt like this one. The lock was solid, the camera functional, the space inside exactly as I'd arranged it months before. I poured a glass and sat on an overturned crate, looking at the shelves of records and the modest wine collection and the tools hanging neatly on the far wall. This was what Pamela had been so desperate to see. This ordinary space held nothing but the organized life of a man who valued boundaries. She'd imagined secrets and crimes and evidence of the corruption she'd projected onto me. Instead, there was just this paperwork, wine, silence. I thought about boundaries as I drank, about what they meant and why they mattered. They weren't walls designed to hide wrongdoing. They were lines that defined where one person's authority ended, and another's began. Pamela had never understood that. She'd believed her position entitled her to cross any line she chose, to enter any space, to control any person who fell within her jurisdiction. The law had disagreed. The community had disagreed. And now she was gone, and I was still here, sitting in a cellar that belonged to me on land that belonged to me in a neighborhood that had finally remembered what belonging was supposed to mean. I finished the wine as the sun set, then locked the cellar behind me and walked back to my house. The neighborhood was quiet. Lights glowed in windows up and down the street. Somewhere, a dog barked once and fell silent. Everything was exactly as it should be.